officially welcome New York Times bestselling author Sandra Brown, over 80 novels, 75 plus New York Times bestsellers. What is it? Over 80 million in print worldwide.
That's what they tell me. But I haven't personally counted it, so I don't know.
Well, it's so good to see you this evening, and welcome to joining us for Virtual Book Club.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I've been eavesdropping for 30 minutes. And first of all, thank you and Sarah. I'm so impressed by the people who still read, and it was so rewarding to hear them talking about reading ARCs and reading old books like mine. And so many of my colleagues, Susan Elizabeth Phillips and Jetty Robb, who is Nora Roberts, and it just means so much. Kathy Reichs, the Bone series, all of these are mentioned, and these are all buddies of mine. And I know that I speak for all of us when I say thank you so much, readers, for still reading us after all these years. But it's very gratifying, and I appreciate you for discovering new writers. This is something that we in the industry are constantly striving toward, is cultivating new readers. And the young woman who just said, that she started reading me 25 years ago, and I turned her on to reading. And that's the most gratifying compliment that I could ever get. And occasionally I do get someone who said, I never read a book. I hated reading until I was in the hospital and somebody gave me one of your books and I didn't have anything else to do, but they became a reader. And nowadays, when we're in competition with so many other outlets of entertainment, it's ever more important that we cultivate readers, and especially in our children, because once you develop the habit, it's really a habit that you can never get over. I'm sorry, Samantha, I'm going to be looking at you, but I'm also going to be looking at this camera, and I never know which way to look. So
no worries, Sandra. I have the same problem all the time. But I can relate to everything that you're saying, because I mean, that was where my love of reading started, was with my parents, who were both voracious readers. And I remember Dad reading The Hobbit when I was, knee high. And that's one of my treasured memories. But it's also been a big escape for me over the years. And especially when, with personal losses on things, that you needed that distraction, and books, no matter what kind of story you were reading, tended to be that escape. And look how I'm going to twist this around now and back to the book with Out of Nowhere, the latest release. I mean, it starts off with a traumatic event. And again, it just examples of how people need to be able to cope and figure out what is the best method for their survival after something like this. And I think that tended to be the theme out of the book that I was gathering, that even though it started with this traumatic event, it was a tale of survival.
And that's why my publisher asked me to write an essay for the Reader's Guide for book clubs. And so I wrote this kind of like an essay, and then they said, this is so heartfelt. Can we put it as a foreword in the actual book? And I said, well, yeah, I guess so. But I really hoped that readers would not skip over that, because I wanted everyone to know that I didn't want to particularly write a book about mass shootings, because even on the day that I was drafting that forward, there was another mass shooting where people died. And I just was like, what is going on? But I didn't want it to be about that as much as I wanted it to be about what happens to these people. And there were I guess Uvalde, Texas, but on when I was eavesdropping, there were so many people from Texas. Well, Uvalde, I live in Fort Worth, so it's about, I don't know, 400 miles from me. But everyone in our state was so involved in the recovery and the how horrid this event was. And even though the shooter had been taken down, and then there started blame being laid on this and that, this and the other, and it was in the news forever. And the family survivors and everything are being interviewed. And then after 6 or 7 days, another like event occurred and their story went away. But this is a story that will live with them till they draw their last breath. They will never get over it. And so that's why I wanted to say in this author's note, in this forward, that the survivors who have to live with this every day for the rest of their lives are casualties also. And that was the story that I was compelled to tell. And I tried to get away from it several times. I kept saying, no, I don't want to write about that. I don't want to write that. But then Calder walks in and Elle walks in. And then the detectives come in and they come into my head and they're saying, you've got to tell this story. It has a purpose. And it is life affirmation. It's the affirmation of life that whatever happens to us in our lives can affect us deeply, can cripple us in many ways, but life is life. And God gave us the survival instinct. It's the strongest instinct that we have. We survive. And that was the story I wanted to tell.
And so was the storyline what came to you first, or was it the characters? You said that they kept coming out and
Well,
speaking to you. They're so relatable. I mean, and again, living in Texas, I mean, the state fair for us is starting this Friday.
and I want to Fletcher's corny dog. I want to Fletcher's corny dog, by the way. That's my go-to fair food. I'm sorry I interrupted your question.
No, it's just that all of these characters are so relatable because you have the stay-at-home mom with Elle, you have, you know, the consultant with Calder and living in the high rise of Dallas, and yet they're still drawn together. It's just, you can picture all of these things because again, going to the state fair or any of the local county fairs, pulling together all of that, those different inspirations, what really jumped out at you?
Well, it was kind of a combination of things because it says a mass shooting was the last thing I would have ever chosen to write about. But then, as I say, these characters, and this is not only true of Out of Nowhere. I'm sorry, I've got allergies. My eyes are watering. That it wasn't only about that, but with every book, these characters just start showing up in my head. And I thought, if something horrendous like this happened, what would be, you'd have two people, strangers, who were having to deal with the same problem. And so let's make one, this hot shot. He's got the world on a string, he's just had his best day ever, he's got everything going for him. And this absolutely cuts him off at the knees. And then you have this young woman, very self-effacing, rearing a child alone, having suffered heartache and everything. And then when they come together, there is this chemical reaction, but is it because of a chemical reaction that's ordinary, or is it because of the event that they, suffered? And I just thought that would be provocative. And then it was like, but what make it even, from the novelist standpoint, what would make it even worse is if he had tried and failed. And I don't want to give too much away, but what happens in the book is to me, it was a very provocative for him. How would you ever get over that? Mm-hmm. It was the only, and he even says in one scene, he says, I have failure issues. And she says, when have you ever failed at anything? He said, never, until it counted. And I thought, that's my character. That's my character. I heard that word of dialogue in my head. And those sentences in my head where she's saying, how would you know about that? And he says, never have, until it counted. And I thought, that's my character. And so throughout the whole book, I really put Calder in a pit, in the first chapter, and I just keep throwing rocks on him because it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. He finds out, about the bullet that killed Charlie. And then he finds out more. I mean, it's just one bad step after another that he has to cope with. And yet, at the same time, he's falling in love. And that's bad enough under the circumstances. So it was like, yeah, that's bad enough. But then he's got to deal with this.
And also with the secondary characters, because I was also fascinated with Shauna as the reporter and the struggle, because again, you see this in the news and with other reporters, and how do you humanize the overall story versus it just becoming a group of statistics, so that you have people who are invested and care about it, but you still need to report the news without crossing those lines.
I had two reactions to Shauna. First of all, I didn't like her very much. I don't think anybody would say she was a warm fuzzy. But also, I mean, she was doing her job, but I do think she crossed a line. From a novelist's point of view, I had to allow her to cross that line. And I know that that's their job because I come from a journalistic family and had worked at a TV station. My ex-husband was a reporter for a TV station. And so I know how, it's get the story. But I also think there's a difference in getting the story and invading the privacy of the people who are suffering through this. And as I referenced earlier, during the Uvalde, there were some of the family who just said, we are closed, just like Elle was in my story, just closed off to the media. We won't talk to them. We won't share our grief on that kind of public forum. But then other people feel that it's almost a responsibility vested in them that they didn't ask for, but vested in them to share the grief, how shattering this is. So it's a very individual thing. And I think that when any journalist sees one or the other, they should honor that person's feelings. And this is a private, and I mean, nothing is private anymore. And so I think it's up to I think there should be honor in that particular profession to say, leave these people alone. They're grieving. but that's a dicey thing. And so I didn't like Shauna. And I knew when I put her in place, I knew what she was going to do later on. So I had a built-in prejudice, but I also, in that first chapter where we see her trying to cope, even out of the hospital once they were home, and it had been like a month, and she was like, get over it already, oh my gosh, get back to, and of course he couldn't. And so in a way you could almost feel sorry for her in that scene, because she was doing everything she knew to try to get him back to where he had been, but she couldn't understand the depth of the suffering that he had gone through and was going through.
How did you find balancing all the different aspects of this story? Because
I don't know.
Having a tragedy, right, the tragic nature versus the survival element, the romance and the relationship between Ellen Calder, but then it's still a classic suspense, as because you're trying to figure out, I mean, it's the pursuit of justice, right? And so there's still all the chase that's going on. And I'm trying to say all this without, revealing twists and too much information, but there's just a lot happening.
Right. Well, that was the challenge to me as a writer. And I have always, over the course of my career, when I started writing early romances, it was like, never repeat yourself if you can help it. And so with each book, I kind of build in a challenge to myself. What haven't I ever done before? Why is this book going to be different? And in this book, I really bit off a lot, because first of all, it was a very politicized, divisive subject. It was something I would not have chosen to write about, even though it was timely. I typically don't even embrace, controversial things like that, and worldly things. I always try to put my characters in a very small microcosm, and it's a small problem. This was a much larger one. Once I had determined this is the story I want to tell, my characters want me to tell, I need to tell, to give hope to people, maybe. But then it was like, okay, so you've got this situation, but you've also got to make it Sandra Brown novel. And Sandra Brown has a brand, and people expect twists and turns. They expect suspense. My publisher expects a suspense. And so it was like, how in the world am I going to create this intensely emotional book? I could have written the book just about their struggle and left it at that. Or one of their struggle. Could have done the book about Calder, or could have done the book about Elle and just left it individually. But since it is a Sandra Brown book, had to combine the falling in love in the worst possible circumstances, and yet keep the action moving, keep the clear and present danger. And so I got about, I don't know, the prologue written from the first person of the shooter was an afterthought, because I got about 10 chapters into the book and I was so caught up in the relationship and how in the hell they're going to work this out. But then I thought, wait a minute, this isn't, there's got to be, trouble coming up the other side of the mountain that they don't see. And so that's when I thought, how can I integrate a villain into the story that you do not see? And so I went back and I just wrote the prologue in first person. And then along the way, as there were plot elements, coming up, I would insert the other things. And I even sent in the manuscript, my first draft, to my editor. And I said, I just felt like they needed somebody breathing down their neck. And the reader can't know who it is, but I just feel like they need somebody breathing down their neck to keep the momentum, keep the suspense high, keep it taut. And I said, but if you don't think this works, just take those segments out, because the book would stand alone without them. And he called me back and he said, oh, no, they're great, because we do get into the mind of a human being who would do that.
With the timeline of the book, did you start off with the fair? I mean, was that the first thing that you were putting to paper?
No, I started with Calder. Well, actually, yes, you're right. I started chapter 1 with him, and I wanted, well, we have a term in Texas which you can't use, but but I wanted him to be just real cocky, arrogant, I am, all of that stuff. The last thing he expected, and the first thing he wanted to do, was go home and get in bed and, what men do. But then he has this argument, but then he says, the only chance I have, I mean, his whole goal was, let's face it, getting laid that night. And so he goes to the fair under duress. I'll do this, And so I wanted to leave it there, and then I started with Elle. So I wrote that whole first chapter, and then, as I say, about 10 chapters later, but then I went back and wrote the prologue. But yes, I wanted to start it, and I didn't know what the venue was going to be, but I was trying to think of because of the plot, that how am I going to do this? And it had to be somewhere where people were compressed. It would be right, like a stadium atmosphere, or a, something like that, where people would be compressed and shoulder to shoulder and intensity. And so that's why I thought of the fair. Yeah.
Well, Sandra, I want to switch over to what we call our fresh fiction facts, which are meant to be some quick questions, hopefully answers off the top of your head, not meant to stump you, although sometimes it does happen. Okay.
It probably will, me.
Well, you heard earlier the variety of books that people in our book club read, and many who are revisiting some books over and over and over again. What is your most dog-eared copy or reread book?
Oh, gosh.
One that you go back to all the time.
Yeah, I do. I go back to some Evelyn. Probably never, Evelyn Anthony books, which were romantic suspense. She was an English author who wrote under various names, but her books were just so instrumental to me. I reread Eye of the Needle, because Follett incorporated this spy novel with one of the sexiest books I've ever read. And I thought, this can be done. this can be done. And it only ratchets up both elements. It ratchets up the sexual tension if they're in danger, especially of each other or for each other. And it ratchets up the suspense because then something's got to happen over here. I mean, it's like it's now or never, and so it was the heightening of both elements of that. So I reread that a lot. I go back to the early romances, Candace Camp's, oh God, Rainbow Season, one of the sexiest, loveliest books. And she was the first real life author I ever met.
Really?
And I was invited by a colleague, another Texas author, to go down to Houston to a writers conference. I said, well, I can't go because I'm not a real writer. She said, oh yeah, you are. I hadn't sold anything yet. And at a cocktail party, they said, Candace can't, she wrote under Lisa Gregory, that book, but Candace Camp is going to be there. And I was like, well, my heart will stop. It was that kind of thing. And I still reread that book. So there are many, but I was influenced by so many various storytellers. There was an author named Taylor Caldwell who wrote these family sagas.
Loved her.
Oh my God. Testimony of Two Men was one of the best books I'd ever read. That influenced me. A big Tennessee Williams fan. Nobody could write family turmoil and just raw emotion and that Southern decadence that I just love. And so there were so many, but yeah, there are a lot of books that I go back and read. A lot of historical fiction. Lisa Kleypas, I love all of her books. Mary Ballow, I mean, they're wonderful. They're enchanting. And I once was sitting on a panel with Lee Child, and someone was, and it was early in International Thriller Writers, and he and I were both in on, some of the ground floor workings of that association. And I remember sitting on a panel with him and somebody said, well, how would you define a thriller? And he said, well, I think every book should be a thriller. It should thrill the reader, whether it is a child reading, the Nancy Drew, or like I did, or if it's an adult reading an espionage novel where, someone's hanging by their fingernails. I mean, whatever the book is, it should thrill the reader. And I thought, that's a great, I'm going to use that. I'm using it tonight, Lee. But it's like every book should thrill the reader.
And again, it goes back to that escapism that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
That's what you're going into those books. You're wanting that escapism, that thrill.
And don't you have such hope when you open a book that don't you have such anticipation, like, just dazzle me. So before I was ever a writer, I was a reader, and I'm still a reader. And every time I read a new book, or I have 4 sisters and all younger than I, but we are all voracious readers. And so we'll send out, a text like, what are you reading? What's good? I can't find anything. And so I'll say, well, you might check this out. And when you open it, you want to be absolutely dazzled. You want to be riveted. And so I share that hope, that anticipation with every reader out there tonight.
Who was your first book boyfriend or girlfriend?
Book boyfriend or girlfriend? Probably Brandon, in The Flame and the Flower. You remember Brandon?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, he was just, I mean, Kathleen Widowis, you just couldn't top. I mean, she just created enchanting characters and flyaway stories. But yeah, he would be one of them. And of course, everybody loves Darcy. And Darcy has been the seed, the genesis of every romantic hero, you know, that we still write. The Beast and Beauty and the Beast. And a Sandra Brown book, my heroes are always a little on the edge. They're not the nice guy. And it's the heel appeal. And so I get a lot from Beauty and the Beast. It's taming the beast, finding the one vulnerability in the beast. Yeah.
Okay, a little bit on the personal side. What would be the most annoying thing about having you as a roommate?
I will I will die with a rag in my hand. I am a neat I can't stand a mess, and I go along behind everybody, you know. The sink is always dry. I mean, I'm almost OCD on neatness, because my mind is so chaotic. I think, you know, it's always thinking of dialogue. It's always going off on tangents, or what about this? What about this? What about this? That some element of my life has to be organized. And so my workspace is my dressing table, is my bed. It takes me 30 minutes to go to bed because the covers have to be just a certain way, and the air has to be a certain way, and the blinds have to be a certain way. So that might be a little irritating to a roommate.
Well, I was also going to ask you, what's your favorite thing to do when you're trying to procrastinate for writing? And I'm guessing that it would be something cleaning related then.
Well, procrastination, yeah, it can be that, but mostly procrastination would be sitting with a book. And I'll think, well, at least I'm cultivating my art. I'm reading a book, you know. So, and I'll cheat and I'll get to chapter 15. It'll be like, I don't want to go back to that computer. I got to read the next page. So, yeah, I'm a compulsive reader. So I think to get away from work, probably what I would do is pick up a book, and even if it's one of mine, I would reach for it, open it up, start reading it, even in the middle, and go, I have no idea what comes next. I don't know. I remember the story, but I want to read the next chapter, you know. And when I'm sitting here unable to think of a story, I will look at 85. Out of nowhere was number 85. And I will look at 85 books on the shelf, and I will think, you know how to do this. Why is it so hard? But every book is so hard. It's just hard. But, you know, and I still, as I said, I try to do something with every book that is a challenge to me, that challenges me as a writer, so that I don't get stale, so that I don't get repetitive, always looking for that thing that is going to make this book different from anything else.
Well, even though Out of Nowhere just came out, you know, us readers, we're always wondering what's next. What's the next thing for us to look forward to? What are you working on, and can give us a sneak peek?
Well, I've written about maybe 20 pages, and I do as I sometimes do, just open up a scene that comes to my head and start writing and see who shows up. And I did that about a month ago. And because publishing a book is also work, getting it out and promoted and everything. So I allowed myself plenty of time, but I thought, let's just see where this goes. And so I just opened it up on a scene I saw in my head, and I started writing it. And then the heroine had a pretty good line at the last line of the thought. And I thought, I'll end there. And am I asking myself questions? Am I saying, who's she? Who's he? What's his story? What's her story? What does she mean by that? Because that's really provocative. And she's in the wrong place. She doesn't belong there. And so all of these questions that I'm asking myself, I would feel like the reader will be wanting to know also. And the first question I ask in the book, which in this case was really, and out of nowhere was really the prologue. It's the first question you ask, who is this, is the last question I answer. So that's what's keeping the reader. So I try to plant a question in the prologue or the first chapter. It's subliminal, but it can be as blatant as who done it, or it can just be something that doesn't quite compute. And that question is the last one you answer. So there are other questions along the way that you answer along the way, but you save that one thing. And it's that one thing that I know that the reader doesn't know, that tells me that an idea wants to be a story. It's the reason why you're writing the book. Maybe a great idea, but does it want to be a story? And I know I have a story when I know one thing that the reader doesn't know, and withholding that throughout the entire book until I get to the end.
Well, with that, where is the best way for our readers to keep in touch with you and find out the answers to those questions?
Well, let's see. I Googled myself today to find out all the good stuff. And some of it was wrong now. But anyway, I'm sandrabrown.net or sandrabrown.com is my website. I try to keep up with it. I'm on what is it now? X, not Twitter, but X. Twitter. Yeah. And my Facebook is author Sandra Brown. And so I'm out there. If you look, I was happy that when I put in my Google search and I just typed Sandra Brown, I was the first one to go. And it said American novelist. And I went, I can live with that.
That's not a bad title at all. No. Well, Sandra, it's always so much fun with talking with you and having you join us for a virtual book club. So thanks again.
Oh, by all means.